My next guest has been on this show before. He's actually one of my best friends. He's a professor and published author who's actually published multiple books. And in this episode, he talks about 3 different ways you can become a published author. Please welcome Chris Yogerst. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Well, we had you on in season 1, but if the audience hasn't heard about you, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. My background, well, I'm a university professor. I teach film and media and communication classes, but my interest is in the history of media, the history of film, the history of popular culture. And I like to write about how that popular culture engages with the history of politics and the history of our world and the history of conflict and all kinds of stuff. So I've really used that to build into kind of a writing portion of my career where I'm writing books about that history and articles about that history and trying to reach out beyond the walls of the university to engage people with that history.
Nice. So in this episode, we're going to talk about 3 different ways you can generate revenue or publish books, and then other ways you can generate revenue from the publishing of those books. It kind of leads to other projects. So at a high level, why don't you tell the audience those 3 different ways, and then let's dive right in.
Sure. So when you're looking for and another part of this, right, is your ancillary, your revenue, but also building credibility along the way. So you've got your self-publishing, which is anybody can publish. There's a lot of ways to do that. There's you can write your own book and pay a little to have it published. Some people pay others to write their books. Just probably not the best way to do it if you're looking to build credibility. And then you've got university presses, which a lot of people might not, outside of higher education, might not have considered, but they've become very, very dynamic in recent years. And then you have your trade press, or your these are like your big 5 publishing houses in New York, and there's other big indie presses around the country that are also different. They got a bigger reach, bigger advances. There's advantages to that as well. But those are really the 3 big ways that people try to get their work out there in terms of books.
Yeah, become a published author, if you will. Dive into self-publishing a little bit. I'm familiar a little bit with Amazon has like a pretty easy URL. I don't know it off the top of my head, but you could just pretty much Google Amazon self-publishing, and I think it'll bring you there. That kind of walks you through the process. So is that kind of what you're referring to, or are there other ways to self-publish?
There are other ways to do that. So I know, obviously, we know each other, and I know you wrote a book. It was very good. It was a very good way for you to share your story. It's a very powerful story. I'm glad you did this so other people could see it. And it's there that's a very common way to kind of get a very quick turnaround and get your story out there. There's other ways to do it. And I don't know some of the presses off my hand, but I know they're generally, like, if you just Google like vanity presses, you'll find stuff where, generally if a publisher wants money from you to publish, you probably shouldn't do it. It should always be the other way around. Same thing if you end up getting, an agent. They only take 15% of what you make. You shouldn't be giving them anything up front. So anything that's up, if there's any publisher that's looking for money up front, I wouldn't trust it. But like you said, the Amazon stuff, that's more legit in the sense there's a lot of people who just, people who write fan fiction, or people who write, it's another maybe extension of someone's blog, right? They might have a blog they're trying to grow, and they don't, maybe have connections, or they don't want to do the research or legwork to go through all the hoops at these other publishers. So that might be a quick and easy way just to get your stuff out there, shared, so people can see it, and that, try to grow a following that way.
Right on. To drill, because the audience might have a question here, like, hey, you got a book? So, and I think I may have told you this, but I pulled the book down and I wanted to expand upon it. This was like 10 years ago since I wrote it, and want to actually, believe it or not, use the podcast kind of as a framework. It'll be like 10 different business models, like my top 10 on how to create passive income or financial freedom. It's kind of like, have you ever read Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss? The concept is pretty simple. He's interviewed like, I don't know if it's like 50 different people, and it's a pretty large book, but he summarizes like the key takeaways from each. And I think it's like health, wealth and finance or something like that, different categories. But like Jocko Willink is one, Arnold Schwarzenegger is another, a few other business leaders. But it's pretty cool. Like you could take like an hour interview and compress it into like what are the key takeaways, and that's essentially
Sure.
what I want to do with the book, which will be that like, okay, my top 10 favorite business models referencing podcast interviews and just compress like, okay, what are the key things they did to achieve XYZ or whatever. So anyway, that that'll be a project I revisit at some point, but it is on the list. And I'll most likely,
Awesome.
this is a good episode because I'll kind of learn what will be the best path for me. It probably will be self-publish, and I'll probably have to pay a little money. So I'm sending money the wrong direction, but it'll be one of those credibility things to hopefully kind of get people warmed up to me, the podcast, and of course, Ticker.
Well,
but
and that's
then,
one of the last things I was going to
yeah,
add is sending money the wrong way. That's a good way to put it. But there's an asterisk on that, because it's like if you're sending money the wrong way and you're just starting out and you don't have any following, that's probably bad. However, you've got a website, you've got a business, you've got a podcast, you have a platform, right?
yeah,
You have the stuff, so you can, so there's some people who might not need or want, there's not wanting to jump through the other hoops, but they might not need to. So, if book publishing isn't, like, for me, it's much more central. So if that's not the central piece of, your business model, and it's a
right?
supplementary, then that's a perfectly fine way to do it, to get more of your story out there.
That's what I'm thinking. And I know with self-publishing, I'll probably go through Amazon. Any listeners out there, you probably don't want to just like write it and then upload it and have Amazon do its thing. You probably want like a person in the middle, an editor, like to like not your friend, but like a real editor, like to go through. So that'll be a fee. But I'm preparing for the costs, and really it's just a time investment thing to like put everything together, like really look at all the podcasts I've done, kind of summarize those and kind of write like a quick story, or okay, what does this person do? How do they make money? How do you achieve financial independence? And bam, put it all together into a book, hand it off to editor, then off to Amazon, and the rest is history. So the self-publishing, I think it's really good for somebody who wants to have that credibility stamp, like, hey, I have a book. I hate to say it, but like people just use that and people will say, wow, they wrote a book, so they're credible. It's like, sure, yes, in some cases great, in some cases it's like it's just vanity, but anyway.
Absolutely. And I know I've had that. I've had family, friends and stuff too. My parents would be like, oh, my son's new book. They'd be like, oh yeah, my son wrote a book too. And it's like, yeah, you paid someone to self-publish it.
Yeah.
Or you paid someone to write it and it's self-published. Different. But
yes,
even with your book, like, a little bit of the process, your first book, I mean, you generally not having a friend write it, but you had me read it because I'm a writer and I had published books.
Yeah.
So I had finished one. I was working on my second at that time. Yeah, wherever, that's the key. The key thing I would say with self-publishing is, because there's not really any oversight, make sure you get feedback.
Yes.
Have people read it. Even if you have friends, friends read it. I mean, get somebody to read it, get a couple people to read it at least, just to give you some feedback. Does it flow? Is there any, what else would you want to learn? Is there any parts of the story where I'd want to learn more as a reader, that kind of stuff? Those are the kind of things that you would get going through a university or a trade press that you're not going to get. So it's important to try to find ways to still get that feedback.
Sure. Right on. So this leads to categories 2 and 3, which is where I would put that more in the category of real publishing. Self-publishing, some people would argue with me on that, like, oh, it's real, Sean. It's, like you just alluded to, like, yeah, you're a published author, but you self-publish. But anyway, it gets content out that can be marketed in other ways. So there you go. Wonderful. Now you get to university press and then trade press. Let's talk about university press. With both of those, you're getting paid. Is that correct? You're getting paid to write a book. And in order to do that, to get paid, you have to put together a book proposal, right? And that's kind of like the hook to a publisher to say, hey, I can do this. I'm worth the investment. Is that essentially the process?
Yeah, pretty much both university and trade presses, you're going to need a proposal.
Yeah.
And that, there's a lot that goes to that. That could probably be a whole nother episode.
I'm sure.
Breaking that down. But university presses, so historically, university presses, right? It's usually just academics, and then there's a tiny royalty, and these are books that would go to libraries only, university libraries. That is shifted, and really, what we're seeing are, and those generally would have no advance,
Okay.
but that's
What's
starting to
real
change.
quick? Yeah, real quick here. What's an advance for the audience?
So an advance is basically an advance on royalties. So they're paying you up front, and however much they pay you, you don't start getting your royalties when the book comes out. You don't start getting your royalties until the press makes that money back, however much they gave you. So a lot of presses don't do, hadn't done advances, but because publishing is such a crazy world, and there are a lot of good writers that are having a hard time getting published in the trade press. So they're even some famous writers in recent years have went to the trade press or the university presses for books that they couldn't land at, HarperCollins or Penguin or
Sure.
Knopf or wherever. So, like for example, I just finished a book for the University Press of New Mexico. It's not out yet. It's a short history on a film called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. They've got a new series, and they paid $3,000 up front for that. So not massive, but it's a chunk of
Hey,
money for a small book. And the way most presses pay out is they'll give you a third of it right away upon signing the contract. They'll give you a third of it when you submit the book back to the press, and then they pay the rest when it comes out. And I've heard that's pretty standard, pretty much everywhere. The University Press of Kentucky, where my book that just came out on the Warner Brothers, that's getting a lot of good press. I did not get an advance for that book, but I did get really good royalty
nice.
margins.
Could you,
But
yeah,
I
give the
have been
audience some like an example of the percentages there, the royalty
right. So
percentages?
your standard contract is probably going to come at you with like 8%, 9%, some of them less than that. I ended up signing up for the Authors Guild, which is not, it's like $150 for a couple years or something like that. But what's nice about this, and this is good advice if you're jumping into trying to publish and you don't know much about it, with the Authors Guild, they have lawyers on retainer that if you get a contract, you send it to them, and within 48 hours, a publishing attorney will review it for you and tell you what you should counter with.
Real quick,
So
yeah. What is the website again? Authors
it's the
Guild?
author. I think it's just Authors Guild. I don't know if
Something like that? Okay.
yeah, I can look it up here. I'm forgetting
Or
exactly
just
what it is.
Google it. And it's like somebody's not going to, I have to ask this question because my audience will ask me,
Authorsguild.org.
.org. Okay.
Yep.
So you could send it to them. You don't have to be concerned about like copyright issues or anything, like because you're putting it out into the ether and you don't want somebody to take it and run with it, right?
Right. Well, you're not sending them. You're not sending the Authors Guild your book. You're sending them your contract.
Oh,
Um,
got it. Got it. Okay.
yep. So just the contract, and then yeah, I mean, when you send your book for review, I mean, generally you're going to be sending a proposal. Sometimes some places will accept a finished book, but a lot of places they're not going to have the time to read an entire book to consider. They're going to want to, and proposals can be pretty
Proposal.
long too, like 60 pages.
Sure.
So, but like with University Press of Kentucky, like I said, I didn't get an advance, but I am told that in some of their newer books, if they are think it's going to be a decent seller, they're in a position to start giving decent advances. And a lot of other university presses are in the similar, so where they're trying to operate more like a publisher that's not just publishing for academics. They're an academic press that is looking at selling books. So they're selling books at bookstores and on Amazon
Sure.
and all kinds of stuff. So the difference with a university press as well is that to be an accredited university press, there's a peer review process, and this can be very helpful.
Mhm.
Um, and I have horror stories about this as well, but usually the editors at the press will navigate this stuff well. The peer review process is basically they will find two people with a similar expertise as you, and they will let them read your book and give feedback. Should it be published? Is there anything that should be amended? Is there anything that needs to be expanded? And it's very useful feedback. There's one time I got like a 5-page screed that this really pretentious academic did not like my writing because my book was too readable. I am not kidding. It was the prose was too accessible, is what the person wrote. And I responded back to the press and I said, "Well, I want people to read the book, don't you?" And they're like, "Yeah, yeah." So we're not
Maybe,
going
maybe,
to
yeah,
right. So every now and then, and they knew how to navigate that. So it was, usually they try to find people who are going to be, and I've been a peer reviewer many, many times. I just finished peer reviewing a book for another press. So I always try to be constructive. And I think that the culture is going that way. So if you're not an academic, actually the book I was reading was somebody who wasn't an academic. They were just a writer. I think they might have a
sure,
blog. I think they're just trying to build their credibility. And the book was good. It needed a little work, but as someone who has written books and done a lot of research, I was able to give them what I think feedback that could make the book really good. So
sure,
this is the kind of oversight you won't see, you won't get with self-publishing, right?
right, yeah,
So that's where it can be really handy with the university press. And of course, with
yeah,
the university press, you're not going to make huge money. I mean, my Warner Brothers book, I'll know in a couple months. I mean, it looks like it's going to be pretty good. Um, but you can't write books for university presses and make a living. It's
right,
all supplementary income.
yeah,
Even for the big presses, it's anymore when you even if you get a big 50 or 60 or $100,000 advance and it takes you 4 years to write the book, like if that's the only money you have and you only got a third of it up front, right?
that's a
That's not going to
problem.
cover,
Yeah.
right?
Let's
So
let's transition to that third category, which would be trade press, and then we can kind of summarize the differences between the two. But this is the third category where, as opposed to self-publishing, where you're paying money. In this case, you're getting paid, and the 30% advance. That's still you could say the standard.
yeah, I've been told so with the trade presses, I've learned a lot about it. I don't have any books in the trades yet. I have some being considered. I have an agent,
Hmm.
and we're working through that. And I've had meetings with editors, and so I've learned a lot about it. And yeah, it's definitely the holy grail of publishing.
Yeah.
It's where I'm, and but that's all, all these previous things I've done in addition to something we'll probably talk about after this
Yep.
in writing,
Mhm.
out in the popular press and newspapers and stuff like that. The more credibility you build, the more these editors at these big publishing houses will be willing to look at you. So
Yeah.
the university press, you can just email. They have acquisition editors. You can find their emails on their website and you can pitch. With these bigger presses, so this is like Random House, Penguin,
Yeah.
HarperCollins, Kensington is a big indie publisher. These actually, Kensington, you might be able to pitch directly, but a lot of these places you have to have an agent. So you have
Oh,
to um, query an agent, which basically means you have to pitch your book in like 200 words in an email, and they may or may not get back to you.
good luck.
um, yeah, exactly. So it's a lot of, it's like cold calling, cold emailing. You're just, when I was starting this, there was a couple agents I was connected to because they were the agents of my friends. There was a couple agents I got connected to because they emailed me back. And there were some that just said, this sounds cool. It's just not the kind of thing I'm good at selling. So I'm like, I appreciate the feedback. And some people just won't respond. So it's, you got to just be prepared for the range on that. But I ended up finding an agent that, understood a lot of the kind of work that I do. He likes it. So it's like, this is the person you want selling your stuff.
Yeah.
So really what that is they help you with your proposal and they tell you, when it's ready, and then they pitch it to these editors. Once an editor wants to talk about it, then there will be a meeting with you and that editor and an agent.
Got it.
And all three of you will work through it. And I had one book. It was rejected from a press because I teach a class on the history of censorship. And I wanted to do a book for the public on the history of censorship in popular culture. And we found an editor who loved it. And he had awesome feedback. He took it to the board of the press, and the press said, this is too controversial. We can't do it. And it's like, oh man, so this kind of stuff happens too. It's not that it's bad, right? We had an editor that liked it. It was just, my agent has put it really well. He says landing a big publishing contract is effectively publishing by committee. You've
Mm,
got to get you're obviously, I hope you like your work. Your agent likes your work. You find an editor. The editor has to impress a board of directors, and then you go from there, and then you work with the editor on your book at that point. But that's where all those are bigger paydays. That's where you're going to get your
Yeah.
books, in Barnes and Noble and everywhere else. My book is in some Barnes and Nobles, but not like all of them. And so yeah, the trade is
That's
you probably don't
top.
want to
That's
start
top
pitching
tier.
there unless you already have some kind of platform.
Yeah. Yeah, good call. So just to kind of summarize here between university press and trade press, university, it's similar process where you need a proposal. You may or may not get in advance, but you do get some royalties.
Hmm.
And then trade press is it's like a version of that, but a whole nother level with a lot more red tape along the way.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. But also bigger payday, right? All of that, it pays off
sure.
more. But with all of this, there's ways to supplement.
Yes.
Um,
I was just going to
your
ask the how do you tie this into making money in other ways?
Right. So, all along the line. So my first book was Roman and Littlefield, which is an academic press, but also kind of a popular press. I mean, they get their books everywhere. I mean, that first book in 2015 or 16 sold that first year, I think 1,000 copies, and I think I made $1,000 of royalties. I probably could have got a better contract. I didn't know anything. And then, I went to University Press of Mississippi for the second one. That's another kind of long story because that was all during the pandemic, and it was complicated. But in between all of this, once you have some books out, you can start. Something I've been doing even before I was writing books. I was writing film reviews for a while. I was writing for blogs. I was writing blogs on my own website for a while, just practicing writing,
Yeah.
getting stuff out there. Um, but as I was writing books, and as you get yourself out there, you can also start in between all these projects, start pitching articles based on your expertise to major newspapers, major websites. So with film history and pop culture stuff, I've been writing for the last, geez, I don't know, 7 or 8 years for the Los Angeles Review of Books. So that helped build credibility. There was an editor there who really liked my stuff. I got a lot of stuff published. And then the last year, I started writing for the Hollywood Reporter, which is, in Hollywood, that's one of the main key in the entertainment industry, really a key kind of insider magazine. And they've got millions and millions of viewers. So I've been writing for them, and then I'm actually in talks right now, getting a piece ready to go at the New York Times. So it's my first piece in the New York Times. So as you're writing these books, you can get these articles out there, and some places pay, some places don't. The LA Review of Books pays about $100 an article. But
Okay.
when I started writing for them, they didn't pay at all. So, I don't know, the structures of freelancers are always changing a little bit depending on the financial stability. I think LA Review of Books is a nonprofit. The Hollywood Reporter pays $200 an article. And I've got a handful of those in a year. So it's like, now you're talking like, an extra grand, just writing these every so often. And these also help get your credibility out there. So even just looking at, I don't have a ton of metrics, but it's like if I look at, on Twitter, right, that you can see, the views now. So, I just wrote an article last week because there was this talks of Warner Brothers merging with Paramount. Sounds like that's not going to happen now. But the day that news
Hmm.
came out, I emailed my editor and I said, hey, talks of a Warner Brothers sale. Do you want me to write an article about the very first time Warner Brothers was sold? Because it was high drama. It was all over the news. There was a lot of layers. And he's like, oh, absolutely. This sounds great. So they published it, put it out on their social media. And I remember checking it at one point, it had like 35,000 views.
Wow.
And it's like, that's a lot. And then they shared it again the other day. It was like another 20 or 25,000, and that's just through Twitter, right? So it's like, think of, how many more people have seen it, through other
Hmm.
platforms, or just people who regularly read the Hollywood Reporter. They've got millions of followers on social media.
Yeah.
So it's just a way to get yourself out there. But, it took me many, many years of building credibility, getting contacts, meeting people, networking to get into some of these circles. But once you do that, you can use that to supplement, because it's a lot easier to pitch, to have an agent and pitch, Harper Collins, if the agent can say, look, I have an author, he's got a good idea, he's written a couple books, he writes for the Hollywood Reporter, he's got an article coming in the New York Times, um, you know, that shows that's like, oh, this guy has a track
Yep.
record, right? Track record of success, of expertise, of credibility, all of these things. So, there's a lot of ways, all the stuff we're talking about here today, any combination of all of this, can all grow in that same direction, right?
Yeah.
You're building cred, with your audience, you're building cred with subscribers, you're building credibility with readers, and that all of that goes a long way.
When I talk to people about publishing a book, it's like you shouldn't think of it as your like mainstream of income unless you're Stephen King or
Unless you're Stephen King, right? Exactly.
right. Like, yeah, then sure, it can be your only stream of income, but it's like it's that mechanism, it's that credibility tool to get you out there first, and then you can get some work thereafter. Like in my case, you know, putting the book out will be a way to kind of get warmed up to the podcast a little bit or warmed up to Ticker. And that's a win for me. To write articles, no, but I know there's other people that, that have been on the show. There's another woman actually in the Milwaukee area. I had her on recently, Emily Guy Birkin, and she's a freelance writer. And it's like we talked about a book a little bit, I think, offline. It's one of those situations, get it out there, get some more credibility so you can get invited to like the New York Times and these other publications and say, hey, we notice you're the expert with XYZ. Can you write us an article? And you can make money off that ongoing. So it's pretty cool. Your books have opened that door for you. So now you're able to create some, side hustle income on top of your main career as a professor.
Right. Everything supplements everything else. And like as your books grow, the other thing you can do, one thing I've done this year that I've had a lot of success with is book talks. So being, Hollywood history, I'm lucky to have had done a couple talks at Book Soup in Hollywood, which is kind of a famous bookstore out there. And then Larry Edmonds, which is also, it's right on the Hollywood Boulevard there. But what's even cooler is that last month I did a talk in Burbank, right down the street from Warner Brothers, and they had me come and do this talk at this local library. But almost everybody who came, it was well over 100 people came to this event. It was the biggest talk I've ever gave. It was people who worked for Warner Brothers. Some of the Warner family came there. People retired from Warner Brothers, producers, directors, all kinds of people were there. And that's building into other things because they want me to start doing commentaries on their Blu-rays of old movies that are coming out. They want me to come and give lectures to their tour guides. They want to sell my book in their gift shop. All because I came and I did this event, and I, essentially, part of this, I mean, you're selling yourself, right? I don't always, for the purposes of your podcast, I don't always look at it that way. I'm always looking at it as like, I'm trying to get this interesting historical story out there, but right, this is also part of your job. So you're, you're selling yourself, can you captivate an audience with some stories, and things like that. So, right. And I've also been on a lot of podcasts, talking about stuff. And, that's the other thing you can do. Once you have that book, once you have those articles, you can start putting yourself out there. So even if you don't have a big budget, I don't have a massive budget. I did 2 different trips to LA. One of them was, I was also researching another book. And while I was out there, I scheduled some talks, reached out to some places. But if you don't have a big budget and you just got, your computer, you can start networking, get yourself invited to some podcasts. You never know who's going to hear that. They're going to reach out to you. Hey, I want to talk to you too. And, I've probably been on 20 plus podcasts this fall.
That's
just
great.
based on, people I've met with previous books. And then, they, someone else hears that, oh, I want to talk to you too. And, and it just kind of, every time it gets a little bigger. Yep.
Yeah. It just kind of snowballs. That's
it
awesome.
Just takes time.
Yeah. This is not an overnight journey like
No.
any business model. So the life as a writer, published writer, or author. Yeah. It's a long, because you've been doing this 10 plus years. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Ticker. Ticker is a platform that helps you manage your own investments with confidence. Check this out. Let's search for Apple. You can see Apple is on sale. That's looking good. Score is 61 out of 100, and margin of safety is 75%. Higher the score, the safer the investment, and the higher the margin of safety, the higher potential returns you can make. In this case, you can see the share price is 175 as of the recording of this video, and the upside potential, the fair value, is 398. All right, let's look at a different stock. We'll go to GameStop. In this case, GameStop is overpriced. Scores 39 out of 100. That's not looking too good. And the margin of safety is 0%. Here's some other features within. You can create your own custom dashboard. I like to set up and take a look at the top gainers and losers in the last 24 hours. I also like to take a look at the top search stocks, but you can really customize the dashboard to whatever you want. We have stocks, ETFs, crypto. This is a big one. We have a watch list tool that allows you to add stocks to the watch list. And if anything changes, such as that score or margin of safety, you automatically get notified. I call it the set it and forget it feature. And then we have portfolio trackers and alerts. So if you're looking for strong stocks, want to avoid bad stocks, and learn how to invest, I invite you to join Ticker for free.
Well, before we transition to the rapid fire round, is there one good key takeaway you can give our listeners if they want to start writing a book?
One, man, there's a lot. Well, like with my kind of stuff, it's always, I feel like when I review books, my feedback is always show that you've done the research. I sound like a professor here, but really, and anybody can just describe something. Anybody can, think about it in terms of like, if you're writing something, somebody can just Google and find everything. Think about how you can go beyond that. What can you add beyond what somebody, what anybody could do on their blog? What's going to set you apart? So for me, it's going to physical archives and digging through stuff that people can't just find on their cell phone. So whatever your expertise or whatever your subject is, where is it that you can really go the extra mile that the next person won't?
Yeah. I have to drill into that a little bit to the audience out there so you know a little bit more about Chris. He would physically fly out to LA and go to places where the only way to get content is to go to like some physical archive, like in a basement or a building you can't get access to. It's like, you're not going to find this on the internet. It's like, that's putting in the work.
Yep. Yeah, I've been there, been to the National Archives, all the places you see in National Treasure.
Yes.
I've been through there digging through boxes. Yeah, I wrote my book before this was about in 1941, the U.S. Senate went after Hollywood for making anti-Nazi movies. It was a weird time. So I went to the Senate archives in Washington, D.C. And they told me, they're like, yeah, we have a ton of files and they're all disorganized because nobody has looked at them since 1941. And it's like, perfect.
Yeah.
So I went and spent 2 or 3 days going through that.
And yeah, it's not like you said, you can't just Google this and find it out on some blog. It's like, nope,
right.
You gotta, like, this is like physical documents that are nowhere else. That's where you go. That's pretty cool.
Right. And even not every subject matter is going to necessarily need the physical archive, but there's a lot of archives that are digital, but you still got to do some legwork to get at them. So universities are great because they've got a lot of access to databases. So, most any public university, you can get a day pass and go and use their computers and use their archive and do digging around.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, let's jump into the rapid fire round. This is the part of the episode where we get to find out who Chris really is. If you can, try to answer each question in about 15 seconds or less. You ready?
Sure.
Here we go. All right. What is your favorite podcast?
Favorite podcast besides yours?
Everybody says that.
Right. Yeah. Man, that's tough because I feel like I'm behind on podcasts. Right now, I would say it's actually called Writers on Film. There's a film critic in Italy. His name is John Bleasdale, and I've been on there a couple times. But he asks really good questions, and he gets really good guests. I'm like the least famous of the people he's gotten on his podcast. And he asks, he does. It's a good example of listening to a podcast where the person really did a ton of research before you came on And therefore the conversation is really, really enriching.
Yeah. I tell you what, you can, like in my world, if I'm invited on a podcast and they've done their homework, you're right. Like, hey, here we go. This is an interview. Whereas sometimes it's like surface level, don't know anything about me. And that can be okay, but do a little homework. All right. Next question here. What is a recent book you read and would recommend?
Oh man, I'm just trying to think of what I've finished recently. I got too many books. I'm like halfway through. Man, I'm drawing a major blank right now. So it's going to be more than 15
You're a
seconds.
professor. Come on.
I know. I'm trying to think of some favorite. I mean, I can tell you one that I'm in the middle of that's really, really good is
Yeah.
it's a new book on Francis Ford Coppola. Um, Sam Wasson, who's a writer. Actually, that's another cool thing that happened. I did my talk at Book Soup. Sam Wasson is a best-selling author. I got to know him over the last year. So when he learned that I wanted to come to LA and do a talk at Book Soup, he's like, hey, how about I come and I interview you for it? And we just have a conversation. So I ended up doing a talk with this best-selling author, which was really cool. His new book came out, and it's called The Path to Paradise. And he interviewed Francis Ford Coppola at length and a ton of other people involved in his movies, as well as spent time on the set of his new movie. It's really good.
That's awesome. All right. The next question here is a
Really
fun
good
one.
writer.
Fun question here. What is your favorite movie?
Oh yeah, you know this is a really tough one. Um, I would say favorite movie recently seen would be
Yes.
Oppenheimer because I
Okay.
finally saw it, and I know we've talked about it a little bit, but for me, being the cultural history guy, especially that era, I know a lot about the 40s and 50s. I know a lot about the Red Scare. So all of that stuff in that movie tracked really well for me. But other than that, if you want like all-time favorites, you just got to look behind me because it's,
True.
as you know, we're the same age, growing up in the 80s, you can't not love Raiders, you can't not love Ghostbusters.
That's
And I
right.
feel like those two movies are just on a permanent loop in my mind forever.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Awesome. All right. What is the worst advice you ever received?
Ever received? Man, probably the worst advice I've ever received ever in my life that I find countering a lot when I hear, I always find times that remind my students of this is that there was a chunk of my life where I was always told I was too nice and that, if you want to get ahead, you got to be an asshole. And we know that has worked out for some people, right?
Hmm.
But I, that that never felt honest and that never felt true.
You can't sustain
And
it either. If it's
right,
not really you, like don't try to play that card if you can't sustain it.
right. And I feel like a lot of, my success in recent years has been whether it's teaching, whether it's publishing, it's because I always try to be genuine with everything. My writing, I always try to. And here's an example where this came to fruition in a really cool way. So I did that talk in Burbank, and some of the Warner family was there. And the first Warner sale in 1956 was ugly. People had, family members had gotten kicked out of the business. Family members had gotten kicked out of inheritance. It got ugly. Jack Warner was horrible to his son, kicked his son out of the business. Jack Warner Jr., his daughter came to my talk. Her dad was essentially kicked out of the business, kicked out of the inheritance. And I tell his story at length in my book. I talk about which family members defended her dad, which ones treated him poorly. And I try to paint the whole picture. And that was a part of me being honest and true and genuine and trying to learn as much as I could, not taking sides, just saying, like, here's what happened. These are people. They're not all perfect. And this woman who's probably in her 80s came up to me before the talk and thanked me for being so fair to her dad because nobody had
That's
been.
cool.
And for me, it was incredible. And during my talk, when this came up, she had tears in her eyes. She was emotional still all these years later. So for me, it was just a reminder that, if you're writing something, even if you have an opinion about it, cheap shots aren't worth it. You
Exactly.
know, you're not going to build credibility. You might get some likes and some retweets, right? You might get some high fives, but at the end of the day, you're going to look like an asshole.
Yeah.
So for me, it's how can I be fair and genuine? Because that's going to go further. And I also, that's what I want to teach, my daughter. That's what I want, that's what I want to put out in the world. So that was a really cool way that came back, where it really solidified, this is why I do the things I do the way I do the things I do.
Great. All right. We're out of time here, but where can the audience reach you?
I have a website, chrisyogerst.com. I'm on social media, Twitter at Chris Yogerst. And then I think Instagram and Facebook are just C Yogerst. I'm easy to find. Google me.
Sweet. Awesome.
No, I'm thinking of Four Christmases. Google me.
I just watched the film. Sweet. Well, hey, thanks for.
Books are on Amazon, all that.
We'll have links down below, but thanks again for jumping back on the show. Learned a ton here. Really appreciate understanding actually the 3 different ways to become a published author. I think, a lot of people, including myself, it's like, self-publishing, but how do you become a real publisher? So thanks a lot.
Yeah, happy to help. And anybody who's listening has questions, email me. There's a contact me on my website. I'm happy to reach out to me on social media. Don't be shy.
All right. We'll talk to you soon. See ya.
Thanks, buddy.